dive straight into the very next session, which is our Global Crypto Pulse, which is really the state of the crypto nations. The review of the preceding and forthcoming 12 months. Actually, I think just a review of the 12 hours will probably keep us all busy anyway. It's a pretty busy time in this industry. Now, the panel is also once again going to be moderated by Sheila Warren. I said we'll see a lot of her. That's why we call her ours, which is so terrific. So thank you for all your help with this. But the panel really is some amazing, can I call them OGs in a loving way? They really are quite very experienced. We've got Arthur Hayes, the Chief Investment Officer of Maelstrom, his family office, formerly co-founder of Bitfinex. We've got Pascal Gauthier, who's the Chairman and CEO of Ledger, a company we all rely on to keep our stuff safe. Yat Siu, the co-founder of Executive Chairman of Animoca Brands. And of course, Sheila Warren, who we now know is the most powerful woman in Washington. Please welcome the panel to the stage.
We're back. Okay, I'm going to begin by just noting again, this is an unprecedented chance to ask these gentlemen questions, and you can feed them to me through the app, so please go ahead and do that. So we are here to talk about what the heck is going on? What are we coming out of in 23? What are we going into in 24? How do we make sense of any of this? And we're doing all of this in the context of, any minute now, any minute, today, tomorrow, we might get news of a Bitcoin ETF, which might send pulses and heart rates soaring. But I wanted to start by asking each of you kind of a starting question to help us sort of create a discussion and possibly a debate. And so, yeah, let's start with you. So I think we just heard from Christopher, that while a lot of attention is paid on certain economies, a lot of time on the US and Europe, tell us why viewing crypto from a primarily Western lens is sort of missing the plot. What's going on in other parts of the world? And how are we underrating key developments by sort of staying focused on Europe and the United States? And then I'd love for you to tell us, what do you think is the most crypto-friendly region in the world?
Well, let me first start off. I fully agree with you that we can't really look at the state of crypto really only from a Western lens. But because of media and because of the narrative being very English-speaking, most of the context seems to come from that area. But when you look at sort of the most internet users in the world is in Asia. Most of the gamers are in Asia. Actually, biggest consumers of technology actually from a consumption standpoint is actually in the Asia-Pacific region. When you look at, for instance, how Hong Kong has become very progressive in the way that they're looking at crypto regulation, and just to be clear, we're not saying that they're necessarily the easiest place to do crypto. I think sometimes people conflate this idea that when you're friendly, then you're kind of laissez-faire easy. That's not the point. It's more that they're validating it by creating regulation, by creating transparency, which I think is what most people around the world are looking for in the US as well. Tell us what we can and cannot do, right? I think that's the point.
Please. Yes, exactly.
Exactly. And so Asia is leading the way forward there. And I think there is another narrative around that some people are missing, which is that in Asia Pacific, there is a little bit of this sort of sense of we're fed up. We're fed up by being dependent on US technologies, meaning that you have to use Facebook or Amazon or Google. And if you don't, then you're basically beholden to them. And that you see this effect not just in Southeast Asia, you see this in Japan as well. There's a big narrative. For instance, in Japan, we feel that it's much more focused around crypto and NFTs because of culture. In Hong Kong, because it's the financial center, it's very much more focused around, I guess, the financial aspects. And we should also not forget that, big and small companies, even the ones that, have given us a lot of pain in the last year and a half, have actually come from places like Hong Kong. I mean, FTX started in Hong Kong, right? But so has Crypto.com. Many of the Binance efforts all started out in Hong Kong. So much actually started in that area. And Hong Kong also, I think in particular, recognized that it kind of lost a little bit that edge because people left Hong Kong because they didn't have that clarity. Yeah. And for the last 3 to 4 years, Hong Kong has really struggled, right? It struggled with protests, with its political situation, with COVID. And now they've come back with a new administration and they're hungry. And I think that's also different. Before, Hong Kong was complacent. It's like everyone just comes to Hong Kong just because, right? Now it's like we need to win back business. So last year's FinTech Week was amazing. ApeFest was there. There's a lot of money that's being invested. Even the government is basically putting money forward in a kind of sovereign Temasek style way to basically invest in Web3 companies. And they've invited sort of professional individuals from the Web3 industry to join government to help them in sort of advising them in that space. So I think this is definitely sort of pushing forward. Now, in terms of friendly, I would say in this part, some people might say maybe Dubai, UAE type of thing, but I would argue that actually Hong Kong right now is probably the most crypto forward place. I wouldn't say friendly is, friendly. I don't want to sort of give people the impression that it's easy. Right. It's not easy, but they do allow, for instance, retail trading of certain tokens. There's a particular framework in which you can do so. And the amount of entrepreneurs and startups that have come in from the rest of the world and from China. So this is the one thing that is often underrated in the conversation, is that Chinese entrepreneurs are moving to Hong Kong to execute on their Web3 businesses, funded by much of the Chinese capital from the traditional businesses. Mm-hmm. So gaming companies that can't do Web3 in China are funding businesses that are doing Web3 through Hong Kong, for instance. And also, Hong Kong has always been the financial intermediary for China, whether it's money into China or money out of China. And we see the same role that Hong Kong will do for digital assets in the entire sort of Web3 space.
And to your point about being crypto-friendly, being crypto-clear,
yes.
It's not that it's easy, but there are rules, there is a process, you can get a response, you kind of know what you have to do. So
and maybe just on this point, there were a number of sort of fraudulent events that took place in Hong Kong that were sort of in the billions of Hong Kong dollars, which is pretty big for Hong Kong, and that did not shake the administration. Whereas in other places, when sometimes this happens, they're like, quick retreat, Hong Kong actually doubled down on this and said, okay, this is exactly why you need regulation. And they went out and basically gave positive statements to the industry, which is very contrasting to some other places.
Pascal, shifting to you. So we are seeing that self-custody is on the rise, I think, as Eric alluded to earlier. So what are you seeing on both the retail and enterprise side? And then another question is, when you think about the ETF option, okay, so assuming that does come through, how do you see that affecting self-custody, if at all? Do you think it's relevant? Do you think it's a totally different set of, engaged participants that are going to be availing themselves of that option?
First of all, if not self-custody, why crypto? To go straight to your ETF question, for me, ETF is the new Coinbase. The first wave of investors in crypto went through Coinbase first and then to self-custody and ledger. It was you buy your coin from Coinbase and then you transfer them to your ledger. So I guess that, new investors will come in the game through ETFs. And at some point, the problem is if you don't own your money, then you're limited into what you can do with it. And I think back to your previous question, crypto is polymorph, or cryptocurrencies are polymorph. So we always try to, put everything in one basket. But I feel that there is an investment case with crypto, and most of the world right now is working on that investment case. Exchanges are the biggest players in the game, and people trade, every day. So the trading investment side, but we are more interested into the user engagement. For me, it's just like intranet versus internet or something like that. If you buy a Bitcoin on Binance, are you really doing crypto? I don't think so. You have a tracker of a Bitcoin. It's not really your Bitcoin. And you cannot really engage with your private keys with anything else. And I think it's just like not being able to interact directly with the web. So what we're working on at Ledger, whether it's sort of self-custody for consumer or self-custody for enterprise, is how you can, own your stuff, but also interact with apps and dApps that are sitting on top of the protocol. And you try to simplify access to the protocol. Remember when you had your phone before the iPhone, it was very difficult to connect to the web. It existed, but it was difficult. iPhone made it easy. So, our game is like, how do you connect easy to a protocol, online protocol, and act in interaction with different apps and dApps. And people always try to figure out, but what is the real use case for crypto? Is it just buy and hold and wait forever, and it's just that thing, or can we do other things with it? And some part of the world, payment with stablecoins is becoming a thing. So payment is definitely one of the killer apps, and I think we'll see more and more of that in the future. Gaming definitely one. Art. I think, for me, digital art is NFT, is crypto. There is no, there is an argument, we could argue, but, for me, I think this is the future. But if you don't own the private keys, then you don't own anything, and you cannot interact with the protocol. So I think in the next 3 years, what will happen is you'll see a lot of companies working on interactivity and development of apps, dApps, and real ecosystem where if you don't have your private keys, you won't be able to interact. And so I think that will push people to self-custody. We have our role to play into this in the sense that we have to make it much easier, like a much smoother experience. But once you have the combination of security and ease of use, then you can really interact with the protocols, and then there are many things that you can do that are far greater than what you can do with your crypto today.
It is interesting, right? The idea that certainly there's been tremendous progress in terms of ease of use. I mean, from the early days, right, when it was like really you needed a CS degree to kind of figure out what's going on. And I do think as that gets easier, the question that you ask, really, which is why crypto if you're not self-custodying, is going to become, I think, increasingly prominent in people's minds. And so, given that frame and orientation, what do you think is the most crypto-friendly jurisdiction or area in the world?
None of them. I mean,
That's a very fair answer.
None of them.
They're all hostile self-custody.
No, but it's just like, because first so self-custody is not regulated the same way that custody is. Most regulation is applied to custody today. And because it's financial markets, and so, I give you money, you hold it for me, so you have the same regulation as a bank, basically. And that's okay, I think, because it's a black box. And regulators can only regulate for the outcome of the black box. Like, we don't know what's happening, but this is the outcome that we expect from you. As soon as you go into self-custody and the protocol level, there is no regulation. There's very little regulation. Actually, MiCA in Europe has left out completely self-custody. We advocated for this. And it's very important, actually, because if you start to regulate self-custody, then you regulate freedom, like the right to own something. And we all want to have fundamental rights. I mean, I guess.
We hope.
I guess it depends where you are.
I mean, the World Economic Forum next week disagree heavily with this. But, I sort of agree with myself. Let's stay free a little bit. And, and the problem with it, it's a problem of fundamental freedom, I think. And sometimes we don't realize that the argument is about fundamental freedom, the ability to own things. And the digital world can be a trap. If you get trapped into this digital world, it's very difficult to get out of it. So I think, the way that we see it, we have a responsibility to bring tools for, freedom of the ability to own something. And in that, I think it's the beauty of innovation. I think innovation only exists if there is no regulation, or very little regulation. And if you think about innovation in the past, every big company in the world innovated in a gray area of regulation.
Yeah.
And people that are begging for regulation are either because they're very big, so they can pay for it, but regulation have a tendency to kill innovation. And in Europe, we're the best at this. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if you stop moving, subsidize it. So right now, we're in the second phase in Europe. We taxed heavily, and now we are regulating heavily. And in 5 years, you will see Europe subsidizing heavily Web3 companies because we would have missed the train.
I often think that we don't do ourselves a favor by calling it self-custody, because the whole concept of custody is that you're doing something on behalf of someone else when you do it for yourself. So I actually think the terminology really kills a lot of the conversation from the very beginning. But that's something we can work on. We always have, so easy. Taxonomy is such an easy thing for all of us to do in the nomenclature. Arthur, let's switch over to you. So let's talk a little bit about central banks. We heard from Christopher a lot about monetary policy and just generally the role of the nation state kind of in all of this. And so whether it's the launch of a CBDC, whether it's inflation that we talked about in the previous session, what do you see as the role of these institutions going forward into 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, so I think 2024 is an interesting year because it's the year with the most number of national elections, I think, since we've decided that we're going to have nation states.
In human history.
Yeah, and so what always wins in an election? Free shit that you didn't have to pay for, right? And it comes in different flavors depending on the culture of where you're from, but at the end of the day, I'm going to give you something and you're not going to have to pay for it. And so we've been doing this for 80 fucking years. And so now we're at this point where everybody's doing the same thing all at the same time. And so we have all this money that needs to be printed or bought. Who's going to buy all these bonds? Especially if you look at the correlations between stocks and bonds, it's flipped. And now bonds switch from being something that adds protection and diminishes volatility in your portfolio to something that participates in the same way stocks do, so they don't have any sort of use in your portfolio. And they're basically a lower beta version of stocks. So why do you own bonds? And so I think as people start to realize this, then they're like, okay, well, do I really want to choke on all this sovereign debt that's going to have to be issued to pay for all these election promises? Or do I want to buy something else? And that something else, I think that's why the Bitcoin ETF is happening now. That something else might be a pseudo Bitcoin thing that you can put in your portfolio and you can claim you do Bitcoin, but you don't really do Bitcoin. Everybody wins, get to charge fees. Clients think they're doing something, charge them fees. BlackRock gets to make 40 bips. They're happy. Like, everybody's really happy. The money never really left the system because at the end of the day, you can't have all this fiat leave and buy something that's off the balance sheet, because then how do you inflate it away? So I think that's sort of the overarching macro theme. And then on the micro level, you have a lot of people who made a lot of decisions and created these binary outcomes. And the bank term funding program is, I think, the biggest date that's going to come up. Like, what are they going to do? Mm-hmm. They said 1 year from now, the US banking system is really, really strong. Don't worry about it. These banks got it. Just take the money for a year. It'll be all good. So now there's, 150 billion or whatever it is in the program. And I think the Q3 report from the FDIC was that the banks are down something like, 700 billion, or whatever the amount is. Bank of America would be out of business if they realized the losses on their portfolio of bonds, and every other bank would be too, but at least they reported it and told us what it was. So the banking system in the US is pretty fucked. And the question is, are we going to recognize a loss, right? And that's not just a U.S. situation. If you move over to China, right, they have a property bubble. They're 2 years into a pricking of their property market. It took 20 years for Japan to bottom from the 1990 highs. It took 4 years for the U.S. to bottom. So China's going to be somewhere in that 4 to 20 year period of bottoming of the property market, no matter how much money they print. So I think that we're just in this situation where people know one sort of set of medicine, which is make the money printer go burr. And so then now we have to predict, where does the money go? Hopefully it comes into crypto and people have aligned their portfolios in that way. Maybe it goes into AI stocks. Maybe it goes into productive farmland, whatever it is. But I think that's the mindset, at least that I'm in, is, okay, make sure my portfolio aligns with, I know there's going to be all this fiat money printed to make good on these election promises and to keep the system going. So yeah, just own the right stuff, really.
So that's very doom and gloom. I'm quite depressed now. And so
not if you're on Bitcoin, right?
Fair enough. As a citizen of the world, I have to ask you the same question. So, what do you think is the most crypto-friendly jurisdiction?
None of them.
If any.
Zero.
Yes. Okay. Zero. Which is interesting, right? So this is kind of a question for all three of you, because the concept that there's freedom money, I'm going to kind of paraphrase what you said, Pascal, right? This idea is predicated on the idea that there is an existing system where money is not free, and it is the contrast that makes Bitcoin or whatever you want to, whatever crypto avenue you want to choose, attractive, right? It's this difference, this differentiation that you can make between non-free money and and kind of like free money, where you can do things like self-custody this asset the way you can with cash. And so I guess I'm curious, because a lot of particularly Bitcoin maxis and other people in our ecosystem tend to sort of like call, whether passively or actively, for like the downfall of central banks, the downfall of the nation state. Like, all of this is just kind of these terrible institutions that don't have our interests at heart whatsoever. But I do think that it's kind of funny to me to talk out of both sides of the mouth, because on the other hand, the contrast is what makes the thing compelling in the first place. So I'm just curious to kind of get reactions to that and the concept of institutions as a general matter. Because I think, Pascal, maybe we'll start with you, because I think you as you've said, that's an option, and you haven't necessarily expressed disdain for that option. That is an option that exists in the universe, and it has legitimacy, but other options also need to exist. And so I'm curious if I'm reading you correctly, or if you actually are kind of like one of those who calls for sort of pull it all down and let's move to this other model where, where money really is more free.
No, but my point is not like, us versus them, etc. So I'm not calling for anything, for the record. I'm just talking about fundamental freedoms and not being trapped by technology. I think there is a big temptation from sort of governments for the greater good, to use technology to sort of protect us. But by protecting us, they control us. So typically, KYC, AML, before you use your money, you have to prove that you're not a drug dealer or a terrorist. All of us. Well, I don't think that's very cool. And I think technology could probably shift the problem to let everybody be free, but then be able to better sort of track and arrest terrorists and drug dealers, if that's what you want to do. And so my argument is not, the financial system is very complex. Bitcoin is probably an edge to the other system, etc. And like Arthur says, like you have to make your investment bets, etc., etc. Right. But I'm only arguing for the ability of ownership, which I think is a fundamental right. And whether the ownership is Bitcoin or an art piece or gaming things or whatever it is, like you should be able to own them. The fundamental invention of Bitcoin is now you can have like a digital token that is unique and that you can own. Before Bitcoin didn't really exist. Like MP3s, you could copy them infinitely. Now Bitcoin is very unique, and so that kind of technology will be applied to everything that we own digitally, and so we will own more digital stuff in the future. And so the fundamental ability to own them and to keep them for ourselves, I think that's a basic freedom. If you go all the way to regulate self-custody, it means that now it will be. People always ask me like, "Oh, is it going to be a problem for Ledger?" I'm like, "Sure, but not just for Ledger."
Right.
It's a problem for like if you buy an iPhone, you're going to have to KYC yourself.
Citizens as consumers in a variety of different.
Because you can download an app, like you can have the Bitcoin app on your iPhone directly, etc. And so, what does it mean for fundamental freedom? Like you cannot access the web anymore without declaring your identity. That would be the consequence of regulating self-custody. And so right now, I would say, self-custody and, accessing directly protocols is where freedom is, and that's good. And no one killed that yet in the world, so that's good. There is a big temptation to do it, but it's often because people don't really understand. It's not necessarily because people are malicious. I don't think there is. Or before you believe people are malicious, just think that they're incompetent first, and usually this is the answer.
Yes.
But it's kind of true. Like when you help regulators to understand what's going on and you explain to them what self-custody is, they're like, oh, they understand ownership, etc. And everybody, like every normal human being, wants to be able to own stuff. So this is really what I'm advocating for, like the ability to own stuff. And then I'm not a market expert, so I don't know. I leave this to Arthur to comment on this. But fundamental freedom and ownership is what we advocate for.
I would just add that also, for the gaming world, ownership is something. It's like 3 years in a row, and then a sort of survey that the Blockchain Gaming Alliance did to all the gamers who said, why would you play a blockchain game versus another game? And ownership was the number one reason why they wanted to do that. But the principle of ownership isn't really necessarily for a financial reason, or even in the context of maybe freedom in the way of thinking, okay, now I'm a free man because I can own it. It's more this idea that I have the ability to do something with it in the way that I wish to. Yeah. This idea that you should have this freedom of ownership, that you have the rights attached to it. But I think there is also an acceptance that there is certain sort of restrictions that come with the freedom in the name of safety. And I think I see this particularly in contrasting when you live in Asia. For instance, even when Hong Kong is very safe, Japan is super safe, China is safe, but there is something else that comes with the pendulum, and that comes with the fact that they perhaps know more about you. There's a certain level of sort of security aspect that comes to it that the people who live there are willing to accept. So it's quite unbelievable, maybe even for Americans, but certainly in our part of the world, that people want to have the right to own guns in America. That seems outrageous for some people, certainly in Asia. But then for people in America, they see it as a fundamental right, more so than necessarily just the ability to have a cool gun. Right? There's an aspect around there. Right?
Depends on who you are, but okay.
Sure, right? But the point is that the translation of the safety, security, and freedom aspect is not the same for every person.
Yes.
And I think the same, by the way, is true for sort of how people engage in blockchain and on the protocol level as well. We're willing to accept certain things because we want it to be safe, whatever the pendulum shift of that safety versus freedom sort of angle is. And for instance, in Hong Kong, most of the people that we know that have entered the Web3 space, and one of the reasons why I think Hong Kong has been so engaged in this area is because many of them didn't enter because of sort of tokens. That was really the pre-2017, 2018 narrative. People got in through sort of the ICOs and the tokens and that kind of stuff. But actually, around 2021, 22, most of them entered the space because of NFTs. And most of the spaces that people entered the space was for cultural reasons, for community reasons, for membership reasons. And so the aspect of the freedom aspect that you talk about, while important, isn't the predominant reason, as in I want sovereignty over that in this matter. I want sort of freedom of the financial system that we're stuck in. That's not their motivation. And so we also think that the mass adoption for people coming in, because they're not coming from a financial lens, they don't have that same view. That's not to say that they can't evolve into that view, but there's a very big difference between, let's say, the Bitcoin maxis perspective as to why they're in the space versus people who have entered because of blockchain gaming and because of NFTs, who are there for completely different reasons, but still want that freedom because in the Web 2 space, there is zero freedom. Right? The contrast in what we have in the physical world is we still have certain freedoms that we enjoy and we expect that in the Web 2 space is completely gone. Right? Like we're completely beholden to the platforms. We have no rights whatsoever. Everyday Apple T platforms, every day Instagram or Twitter takes away your handles just because they can. And those are the worlds that most of them exist in. So they have a much, let's call it lower bar of freedom because Web 2 is so restrictive in comparison to Web 3. So I think that's probably the contrast there.
Yeah, it's you can't divorce this from culture or from demographics. And so when I think about my evolution and how I think about ownership and how I think about freedom of ownership, it has been an evolution, very much so. And a lot of it is based on my experiences in Web 2 and the challenges I faced with Web 2 companies, right? It's not about money for me even to this day, frankly. It's about information and who has a right to access and own my information and do things with that. But I look at my children who are Americans, and they have a completely fundamentally different view on all of this, right? And it really does start with this idea that they fundamentally, it's as simple as they're in a game, they want to take their cape or whatever and move it to a different game. It's as simple, because she's 8, right? So that's kind of as basic as it gets. But that's pretty profound, because it would not have, when I was 8 and I was playing Nintendo or whatever it was, like the early generations, it didn't even occur to me that was a thing you could do because it wasn't even contemplated, right? Because it was a completely different interface. And so now, because all these kids are digitally native, and I call them crypto native, because it's this idea that why can't I do that? Why can't I have that ability, to your point, Pascal, to have that freedom of ownership and to have that right to take the thing that I earned in whatever capacity I earned it and move it from place to place in a way that's meaningful to me that I decide.
But you always had that freedom in the physical world already.
Yes.
So
correct.
you expect that. And so the contrast there is that in the digital world, we actually didn't have that freedom.
Yep. And we were trained, I think, those of us who came up early, right? We were sort of trained to not expect that and to think of it very differently.
Yeah, that's also because we're digital immigrants.
That's right.
We came in from the outside,
we had to evolve.
as opposed to actually living it.
Yeah, that's right. Arthur.
Yeah, I guess when I say that, I think freedom and all this is great, but I don't think most people want to be free. Because, I think this ETF is going to be very interesting to see how much money people, I didn't want to own Bitcoin before because I didn't want to get a ledger and enter a PIN code or secure my MetaMask or whatever it is. Like I just wanted to I wanted to buy Bitcoin, but not buy Bitcoin. And now I have an ability to do so. And I'm perfectly happy to give away all that, annoying stuff and just get the price performance. So we're really going to see, do people actually value all this freedom that people are supposedly fighting for? Or is it just great, thanks for doing all the work and proving that this is a non-correlated asset to everything else in the world that's super fucked. But let me just go give my money to BlackRock instead of actually getting financial freedom for myself. So it's going to be quite interesting.
But it's not so much financial freedom, it's freedom of ownership. So, and ownership can be many things. And I think, everyone will own digital stuff in the future. So it's not just my point is not just linked to money, because otherwise, I agree, some people, it's easy for them to work with BlackRock. Like they don't want the hassle of, doing self-custody. And also, if you have a few millions in self-custody, it's becoming a thing.
Other concerns.
But products will evolve, so that's even easier in the future. But it's just freedom of ownership. The same way that, I don't know, you can have your phone with you and it's yours and it's in your hand, etc. You don't always need to rent it, I guess. And the freedom of ownership, and the question is, will we own more digital stuff in the future than now? The obvious answer is yes. And so everyone will have digital stuff that they own. We're in Switzerland, so you guys sell watches. When you buy a watch, they give you an NFT. It's actually a piece of plastic that you have to keep forever with a number, etc. And if you lose that piece of plastic, your watch lose some value. That will be an NFT. easy. Like, you know, when you own a watch, like you own the physical watch and then you own the physical piece of plastic. This is old technology that's not going to last. Like, you know, that piece of plastic will become an NFT, and then you will own that because it's your watch.
I guess the issue is like then people try to steal your stuff digitally, right? It's very hard to go around and steal everybody's plastic piece of paper, but it's very easy to insert some malware and some website that everyone uses, and
everybody
who got
their watch stolen from them in the past. Come on, stop lying.
Well,
everybody.
What kind of watches are you walking around with,
Show
Pascal?
us your watches.
The Legend watch. Come on, everybody. Like, we all lose stuff. Like, you know, either you got it stolen or you lose it. Physical
but to Pascal's point, I think it comes down to the utility as well, meaning that one of the reasons why we don't value maybe owning these things as much in the digital world, relatively speaking, is that we don't have the same utility as we have in the physical world. In the physical world, because you can own your thing, because you can own your car, because you can own your phone, the physical connection that makes from it has value around it. And in digital space, only very few people realize this or understand it. So if you have an NFT, it gives you membership into something. If you have an NFT, it gives you access. It can also prove things to you. So for instance, an example where we think the future of marketing will look like very different is that we can now directly target people because of the things they own in their wallet. For instance, if I know that you have a Bored Ape, I know you actually are a real customer. Whereas today, if you wanted to reach out to someone who owns a Philippe Patek or a Rolex, actually, how do you reach them? You don't know how to do that. You have to go and put a Facebook ad on Facebook and hope to hit them with a 1 or 2% conversion rate because they obfuscate the interface in the name of privacy, so you have absolutely no idea how to target them intentionally, and then you basically get zero. You can't actually give them the value. So you're paying all this value to the marketing company who's taking all the margin for essentially a spray and pray approach, as opposed to in Web3, I can actually now directly go and say, if you actually own the watch, I'll give you a discount. And I know you own the watch because you own the NFT. And when those type of utilities come into more use cases where I say, I want to show people that I own this, like how people show that they own an NFT. When I show I have a Bored Ape, I get benefits coming my way. I don't just mean airdrops, although those are nice. I mean sort of access to games or maybe discounts in a restaurant because I know that you're a true customer that has at least a $60,000 asset and therefore I want you. Right? And that's actually what's going to change. And that utility is why then people will want to own their digital asset and then they'll enjoy the freedoms around it because they say, actually, only if I'm free to own it can I enjoy these benefits. So I think it comes from the utility. And because we're so early, we can't really see it. But if it's already happening.
Yeah, there's, I think governments are experimenting with this idea too, right? So the state of California has actually done this pilot where they're looking at car titling and saying everyone loses their pink slip, you can't sell a car, it's a giant pain in the butt, they have to go to the DMV, they have to do some nonsensical process that no one understands, it takes forever, results in violence, you know what I mean? And so they're like, what if we move all of that just onto on-chain, and then that transaction becomes so much more efficient and effective, and it actually saves the government resources because people aren't waiting in line shouting at the local DMV about this thing. And so, very mundane example, but I think that's where this is going to start. It's going to actually come from some of the need to kind of cut spend, to the previous panel, to talking about how does government become more efficient in some of these kinds of places where there is a tremendous burden, right, that the government has to bear because they need to kind of ease the flow of these kinds of transactions to create a functional economy. So I think that's exactly right. But one thing I think that I've been thinking about a lot lately as well is this concept that really it is about agency and choice, right? And so when you have a system that fundamentally captures value and you don't have the freedom of ownership, then you're forced into certain paradigms, certain models of engagement. And you might choose those, but those can always layer on top of something that is open at its base, right? And what we have now is not that. And so to me, what I think the architecture that we're looking for is to say, fundamentally at the base layer, you have this open system, freedom of ownership. If you choose to then pass it on to a BlackRock or whoever it is, that's a choice you can make, and that's a perfectly legitimate choice. And I have no judgment about that choice. I think there are very good reasons why you might want to do that, right? But defaulting to that, I think, is where most of us see, the excitement and the sort of openness to this innovation that we want to see. We want to see that preserved and not, I think, cut by regulation, and not to be forced into a model that has just preexisted simply because it's preexisted. So, I think I want to end with a lightning round really quickly to just say, really fast. Do you want to say something?
No.
Okay, yeah. Just something really positive, right? So going into 2024, what is a thing, or maybe a couple of things that you're really excited about, and that you're looking forward to kind of seeing, blossom or grow, or something that you're kind of looking forward to sort of dying, and not existing anymore either way. And maybe we'll start with you, Arthur, and come this way.
I am really excited about dog money. All sorts of dog money. You know, sheep, bonk, Dogecoin. Like when people are starting to post about that all on crypto Twitter and get rich because they're trading dog
Hybrid
coins,
breeding of dog money.
then I know that we're really back, and this is going to be a great bull
sign.
market.
That's the
a sign, and I'm looking for dog money. And so if you're trading dog money, let me know because I'm really excited.
How about cats? Cats okay?
It doesn't have a hat.
Okay.
With hat, then
Fair
it's
question.
okay.
Cat with hat. Pascal, what about you?
First of all, I don't think 23 was a bear market. I think 23 was the start of the bull market. I think 24 would be a bigger year. For us, it's hardware. We will launch at least one new product, and if not two, in this market. And so I'm excited about that because that will be the next generation of hardware wallets. And I think the gap between what we have now, what we have in the future, is big, and what we have in 25, 26 will be even bigger. And then, just like Yat said, people will start to understand more, like what is self-custody, how you can interact, etc. Because it's true that the ease of use is not on par with an iPhone, typically. But as soon as it gets on par with an iPhone, and it will, then people will see a lot of value into self-custody and interaction that they can have with the protocol. So, 24 is a step towards that future, but it's a good step.
Maybe we'll stop calling it self-custody and start calling it ownership.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe, right?
No.
Yeah, over to you.
Generally really excited about Web3 gaming. That's not just because we're in the space, but also because the last 2 or 3 years, billions of dollars has been invested in these blockchain games that are all coming out roughly at this time. And there's 3.4 billion people in the world who play games, and they're digitally native. So bringing all of those into the space will actually get them interested in the space. They want ownership. They just don't quite understand it. That means also more of them will probably buy ledgers as well, right? And they'll probably buy some dog coins to go with it. But the point is that they enter the world through Web3. We've seen inklings of this in 21, 22 with NFTs, that they join through culture and not necessarily through the financial sort of token ecosystems. And that's how most of the world operates anyway. Most of us see money as a means to an end, typically a cultural community end. Whereas, Web3 crypto started off very financial. And so for a lot of people who were in the space, money was the end. Right? And I think that sort of narrative has now changed. I think the outcome of that will also improve financial literacy as a result. Because when you actually have real ownership of these assets inside a game, then you have to understand why you need to have value, what the value is, what it means. And then if we improve the general state of financial literacy, I think that is, to me, how we redraw the world.
What a great note to end on. Well, please join me in thanking this panel for such a lively conversation. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's terrific.